And now, a passage from The Making of Pennsylvania, the Connecticut Invasion. The Connecticut people were not a very numerous part of the population of Pennsylvania until about the time of the Revolution, but they made up for this lack of numbers by their activity and the largeness of their demands. Like the other divisions, they wanted to live by themselves. They claimed the northern half of the province as their own and maintained their possession of a part of it by force of arms. If anyone will look at a map of the United States and carry out the northern and southern boundaries of Connecticut to the westward, he will see that they slice off nearly the whole of the upper half of Pennsylvania. The northern line of Connecticut will correspond very closely with the northern line of Pennsylvania, passing, in fact, only about a mile or so to the north of it, and the extreme southern limit of Connecticut, if carried westward, will pass a short distance above the forks of the Susquehanna. The two little colonies of New Haven and Connecticut, the latter being situated at Hartford, were amalgamated into one commonwealth under a charter granted by Charles II in 1662. At the time of their first settlement, they had no definite legal title to the land they occupied, and they had no charter giving them the right of civil government. The Connecticut colony at Hartford was an offshoot from Massachusetts. The New Haven people had come direct from England. They were all Puritans of the sturdiest stock, aggressive, enterprising, and independent. They occupied the land by squatter sovereignty, and with about the same feeling that inspired their fellow Calvinists, the Scotch-Irish, who planted themselves on the Pennsylvania frontier. It seemed like a pleasant place. They wanted it. They were the saints, and the saints, as we all know, shall inherit the earth. The Connecticut colony at Hartford soon purchased a title to their land from Lord Say and Seal, and others who had received a grant from the Plymouth Council, who were the grantees of the king. But this grant gave the Connecticut colony merely an ownership of the land and conferred no powers of civil government. The New Haven colony remained without title until amalgamated with Connecticut. The two colonies began their existence almost entirely independent of Great Britain. Their connection with the mother country was nominal. Even after they were chartered in 1662, they were allowed to elect their own governors and had pretty much all the essentials of independence. Having originally acquired their land simply by taking it and having enjoyed so much independence in their civil government, they naturally grew up with rather liberal views as to their right to any additional territory that pleased their fancy. They were never altogether satisfied with their narrow limits in New England. Large families have been fashionable among them, and they have always overflowed their borders. There is no state in the Union that has colonized so many other communities. They have built up a large part of New York, pretty much the whole of Vermont, the famous Western Reserve in Ohio, and innumerable towns in the great valley of the Mississippi. We have already discussed their attempts to effect a settlement on the Delaware in the time of the Swedes and Dutch. We must now consider their more serious and determined devotion to that region. The charter under which New Haven and Connecticut united themselves after the year 1662 gave them for an eastern boundary Narragansett Bay, and the same northern and southern boundaries as at present, namely the Massachusetts line on the north and Long Island Sound on the south. But like many of the charters of that time, it extended their dominion westward to the Pacific Ocean, or, as it was then called, the South Sea. There was a proviso in the charter saying that there should be excepted from this grant any portions of territory then possessed or inhabited by any other Christian prince or state. Such forms of expression were usually inserted in colonial charters. But they were hardly necessary because they merely stated a general rule of law which prevailed whether the charter recognized it or not. The New Netherlands, or New York, long occupied by the Dutch, came within this exception, and when the Connecticut charter was granted, lay directly in the path of its westward course of empire. But having skipped New York, that empire began again, and passed cheerfully westward, cutting out large portions of the present commonwealths of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, and California. This was all well enough for many years, and Connecticut held an undisputed dominion over millions of acres of forests and prairie, and millions of buffalo and elk. But in 1681, Charles II, who had given Connecticut her charter 19 years before, gave another charter to William Penn, which overlapped Connecticut's western domain where it passed through Pennsylvania. Connecticut maintained that she was first in time, and therefore first in right, and that this second grant, so far as it covered her territory, was void. The question was submitted in 1761 by the Penn family to Lord Camden, then plain Charles Pratt, a barrister and attorney general to the Crown. He decided against Connecticut. Soon afterwards, 4 other distinguished barristers, Thurlow, Wedderburn, Jackson, and Dunning, were asked by Connecticut to give their opinion, and they decided against Pennsylvania. The lawyers had in each instance given what their clients wanted, and each side had a learned opinion in its favor. In America, a final decision was reached in 1782 by a committee of Congress, which had full power not merely to give an opinion, but to definitely settle the question. This tribunal decided in favor of Pennsylvania. Previously to that decision, Connecticut had always insisted on what she believed to be her rights, and maintained them against Pennsylvania by force. About the middle of the 18th century, her people began to cast longing eyes out on their western way beyond New York. Exploring parties were sent, and in the year 1750 some tired Puritans climbed the last summits of the Blue Ridge and looked down into the valley of Wyoming. They never forgot that scene, nor will our race ever look upon such a scene again. The valley was about 21 miles long and 3 miles wide. The broad, rippling Susquehanna wound through it, now burying itself in groves of sycamores, and again flashing into the sunlight in wide expanses. There were woodland and meadow, level plains and rolling plains, and the remains of ancient fortifications of a vanished race. Mountain ranges bounded every side. The river entered the valley from the north through a gap called the Lackawannock, and went out at the southern end through the Nanticoke Gap. Both of these gaps were just wide enough to admit the waters, and in some places had perpendicular walls on either side covered with laurel and pine. The valley had evidently been a deep lake, which had gradually drained itself by erosion at its outlet, leaving a level, fertile floor, shut in and secluded by the hills. And this floor, as was afterwards discovered, was underlaid by a bed of anthracite coal. The Delaware Indians held the eastern side and the Shawnees the western side with the river between them. At the foot of the valley were the Nanticokes. Game was abundant. The quail whistled in the meadows, the grouse drummed in the woods, and the wild ducks nested along the river. The deer and elk wandered at will from the plains to the mountains. The streams that poured down ravines to join the river were full of trout, and in the spring large schools of shad came up the Susquehanna. Wild grapes and plums grew in the woods, and here and there on the plains the Indians had cultivated tracts of corn. It was an ideal spot, the natural home of the hunter and the poet, a combination of peace, beauty, abundance, and wildlife such as is seldom found. The delight with which the men gazed from the mountainside while the smoke from the Indian wigwams rose into the still air was quickened when they descended and explored the plains. Only one white man had been there before them, Count Zinzendorf, the Moravian missionary. They returned to Connecticut, and with kindling eye and excited gesture described this paradise they had found among the western hills. They were laughed at as romancers, but the thrifty ones who laughed were careful to send others to spy out the land. The reports were confirmed, and from that time parties from Connecticut visited the valley every season. Wyoming entered deep into the Connecticut heart, and the Yankee lovers were ready to measure their devotion with their lives. The solemn men of the land of steady habits became unrestrained enthusiasts. Their speech became eloquent and sometimes extravagant. When Eliphalet Dyer was once urging the assembly to more strenuous exertions in behalf of their western settlement, an unsympathetic wit handed about an impromptu verse. Canaan of old, as we are told, where it did rain down manna, wa'n't half so good for heavenly food as Dyer makes Susquehanna. Either from unusual ability to express their feelings or from some other cause, these Connecticut settlers succeeded in making the beauty of their retreat known to the whole world. It was the great natural wonder, the Yosemite of that day. It aroused the interest and became the talk of everyone in England. It was described as one of the happiest spots of human existence, both for the simplicity of its inhabitants and the beauty and fertility of the land. As time wore on, and the terrible conflicts with the Indians were added to the charms of nature, imagination became more and more aroused until Campbell, the English poet, expressed the general feeling of his countrymen in Gertrude of Wyoming. This work of genius, in spite of mistakes in detail, has now become as much a part of the region as the rocks and streams. Gertrude is not quite so well known a character as Evangeline, but she is thoroughly identified with Wyoming as Evangeline with Acadia. Then, where of Indian hills the daylight takes his leave, how might you the flamingo see, disporting like a meteor on the lakes, and playful squirrel on his nut-grown tree. And every sound of life was full of glee, from merry mock-bird's song or hum of men, while hearkening, fearing not their revelry, the wild deer arched his neck from glades, and then, unhunted, sought his woods and wilderness again. The flamingo and the mocking-bird were far from their native haunts. Campbell, like other Englishmen, was rather mixed in his knowledge of America, but the verse is typical of his merits as well as his defects, and undoubtedly expressed the general feeling of the day as to the peace and beauty of Wyoming. When in another passage he spoke of Gertrude reading Shakespeare in the woods, he again strained the realities, but most of his descriptions are within the possibilities. It seemed as if those scenes sweet influence had on Gertrude's soul and kindness like their own, inspired those eyes affectionate and glad that seemed to love whate'er they looked upon. Nor guess I was that Pennsylvania home, with all its picturesque and balmy grace, and fields that were a luxury to roam, lost on the soul that looked from such a face. Enthusiast of the woods, when years apace had bound thy lovely waist with woman's zone, the sunrise path at morn I see thee trace, to hills with high magnolia overgrown, and joy to breathe the groves romantic and alone. The Indian wars were not forgotten, and their dark ferocity forms a contrast to the loveliness of Gertrude. But this is not a time he started up, and smote his breast with woe-denouncing hand. This is no time to fill the joyous cup. The mammoth comes, the foe, the monster brand, with all his howling, desolating band. These eyes have seen their blade in burning pine, awake at once and silence half your land. Red is the cup they drink, but not with wine. Awake and watch tonight, or see no morning shine. The poem made its first appearance among the literary circle at Holland House and was published in 1809. Its success was immediate. A second edition was soon called for. Those were the days of Sir Walter Scott, Chateaubriand, and the Romantic school of novelists. Simple human nature in the wilderness was the favorite theme. Campbell, anxious for the fate of his Gertrude, had entrusted her to the care of the generous Sir Walter, who introduced her to the world of fashion.